let's think for a moment. What is church supposed to be in the first place? And I was thinking through, recently thinking through this idea of you can't manufacture authenticity. And when I think about the early church in Acts, I don't remember what chapter it is, maybe chapter 2. But it talks about how they were really living together, uh, living life together, sharing things together. And that wasn't something that was scheduled in, right? Like when you think about church and you think about ministry and you think about going to church and attending church and the quote unquote community that you participate in through small groups and all those things, that is manufactured by scheduling, right? Well, we schedule it. And that's a very American thing. But the early church, what we see is they are very, very familiar, right? They have a very family oriented way of living. And you can't manufacture that. It is this natural thing that is birthed out of people truly loving each other and truly just wanting to be together. And for the early Christians, it just happened that they were centered around following Jesus. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Rethinking Christianity. I appreciate you tuning in to today's episode. Last episode I just kind of rambled, but I got good feedback from it. So I'm going to do another episode where I'm just kind of talking. And, and now that I know that I'm doing it, I kind of do have a few thoughts that I'm coming in with. And they're similar to, I did a YouTube video, but it was only 10 or 11 minutes. And I may try and flesh out, some more thoughts around this thing that I did the YouTube video on. But I hope that everyone is doing well. Things are going good for me. I kind of mentioned some of the stuff that had been going on with the church that I'm in and things like that. When I think about, and I think this kind of ties into what I'm going to talk about, but when I think about my work in church or my work that I've been doing in church, I've been working in church since I was 18. I started volunteering, and that turned into a job over time. But the more that I am in church, I'm continually redefining what I and how I view my job or how I view what I'm doing, whether it's in whatever ministry or whatever. But as I've been thinking through what I'm doing and what I'm called to do in church and things like that, sometimes I struggle with that idea of being called to church or whatever, because I think Christians in general, sometimes that whole I feel calling thing can be overcomplicated, and I think there's a lot of freedom in just simply doing what's in front of you. But my church has been going through some different things with a church split and things like that, and it's been difficult at times. But what I'm kind of reminded of is just serving people and loving on people. And so it's been an interesting season of life. And what I want to talk about is recently I was in Kentucky this last weekend. I went to a funeral for my wife. Her uncle had passed away, but I went to this funeral and we drove back, and I drove back, and I had remembered that the Hillsong documentary or whatever that had been advertised came out on May 19th. And if you hadn't watched that, definitely go check it out. It's really interesting, really sad, but really interesting to observe. And so I kind of partially listened and watched the documentary as I was driving. I don't know if that's safe or not, watching it. I promise I was just listening. But so we were watching and we were listening to this documentary. It was really, really interesting seeing how fast Hillsong New York City blew up. And I want to backtrack a little bit. So when I began being interested in working in church, some of the first people or pastors that I listened to were kind of in that realm of Christianity. So your Judah Smiths and Carl Lentz and those kind of guys, Rich Wilkerson. And I had never seen pastors or people that worked in church look cool. And so I remember, I was telling my wife this at dinner the other night. I remember one of the first books that I ever bought related to Christianity was called Jesus Is by Judah Smith. And, I bought this book, and it actually really changed how I viewed Jesus. And that was kind of my entryway into thinking through do I want to be a pastor? because the way I saw those guys, I was like, "Well, you can be a pastor and be cool." Um, and so for an early portion of my Christian life, I remember being really infatuated by Carl Lentz. I found him really interesting. I thought what he was doing was really different. He's a good communicator. He's very passionate and things like that. And I remember I was in New York City in 2016. I spent some time in New York City, the summer of New York City for like from June to July. I was there, and basically, uh, there were 2 Sundays where we had some kinda time off in the mornings where, I was working on a team that was working with a church, but we had some time off where we could visit different churches and things like that, and we decided that for a couple Sundays, we'd visited Hillsong. I remember one Sunday, it was in this small, like, nightclub, and we visited Hillsong, New York City, and I remember them coming out and, like, the person hosting the service or whatever, they did the worship and the person hosting the service came out and they were like, "Hey, Pastor Carl Lentz is gonna be in the building today," because they wouldn't tell you ahead of time where he was gonna be at because they didn't want a million people showing up at one location, which kinda shows, like, how kinda when I look back on it, when I look at those situations, it's kind of weird that they have to do that because, like, why are people coming in the first place? Is it for that guy or is it for wanting to be a part of community, Christianity, Jesus, all that jazz? But I remember and I was excited. I remember hearing that. I was like, "Whoa, Carl Lentz is gonna be here." So he comes out and actually walks right past our row, and he's kinda, like, being, like, guided to the stage with, like I remember there being one guy and then another guy, and one of the guys had, like, a shirt on a hanger, and I guess because he would, like, sweat a lot when he preached, he had to change shirts, or maybe it was just hot outside, I don't know. But I remember doing and going to Hillsong, New York, and then I went a second time, at the PlayStation Theater that was in Times Square, and it was insane to see how many people were outside of this Hillsong waiting, to get in. And it was really kind of like this really wild thing for me because I grew up in South Georgia at a First Baptist church, and I was in North Georgia during my college years, which is where I was, that time frame in which I was in New York was while I was in college. And I had never really experienced like this big mega church style vibe of church, and I was like really intrigued by it. And Carl Lentz did his thing. He preached. He was exciting. I was like, wow, this guy's so cool, and I really thought it was cool. And so, just to give some kind of background and context to myself, when I was watching this documentary, I was just like really dumbfounded. Of like, I wasn't shocked, but I was just saddened by what all had happened over the course of his like 10 to 12 years working at Hillsong, New York City. And so, like I said, if you hadn't watched that documentary, you need to watch it. It's really interesting, and I think it is bringing these kind of documentaries where they shine lights on churches and stuff like that. I've heard some people critique them because they're like, well, these aren't Christians doing it, and well, I look at that as a good thing. Like, they have no biases. I mean, I guess everyone has biases, but they don't have biases for Christianity. And so people on the outside of church can see what we in the church cannot see at times. And the unfortunate thing is these things should be very, very obvious. But this documentary made me think through several different questions of what we should be doing in church, what is church, who's to blame for this stuff with Carl Lentz. Um, and so I did a little YouTube video. If you want to go watch that, it's on YouTube where I kind of talk through some of these ideas. But I wanted to flesh it out here more. So, Hillsong, New York City. The story of Hillsong, New York City is Carl Lentz goes to Hillsong, Australia, and he goes to college, becomes a pastor of this church, and it blows up, right? And it is very clear that they are doing things in a very specific way. And this is how I came, like Instagram and social media was really becoming popular at the time in which they started this church. And it kind of goes back to, for me personally, like I remember seeing Judah Smith post on Instagram, and I just discovered it. And I bought that book, Jesus Is, and I was like, wow, these guys are different. They're interesting. But, and I say all this to say, like, I don't really agree with that style of church anymore. I don't think it's helpful. I don't really like celebrity church culture. So to let me put that up front. Like, I'm in a very different place now being 27 than I was when I was like 18 to like 23. And when I began like rethinking and deconstructing my faith, a lot of these things I put away. Like, I just was like, those guys seem like cornballs. and they actually aren't as I don't wanna insult them, but I just don't like how they do church. I don't agree with their teaching, and I think it's very shallow, and I don't think it's I don't know. I don't wanna critique too much. But the questions that I would ask is, who is to blame for Hillsong? Like, of course, the leaders are to blame, but I think you have to take it a step back further of like the questioning of what is church supposed to be in the first place? Like let's think for a moment. What is church supposed to be in the first place? And I was thinking through like recently thinking through this idea of like you can't manufacture authenticity. And when I think about like the early church in Acts, I think it's I don't remember what chapter it is, maybe chapter 2. But it talks about how they were like really living together, uh living life together, sharing things together, and that wasn't something that was, like, scheduled in, right? Like, when you think about church and you think about ministry and you think about going to church and attending church and the quote unquote community that you participate in through small groups and all those things, that is manufactured by scheduling, right? Well, we schedule it. And that's a very American thing. But the early church, what we see is they are very, very like familiar, right? They have a very family oriented way of living, and you can't manufacture that. It is this natural thing that is birthed out of people truly loving each other and truly just wanting to be together. And for the early Christians, it just happened that they were centered around following Jesus. And so I think of church now as, and there are going to be some portions of it where, you manufacture something. It's because just kind of honestly how we operate in America. Like we have our schedules and we have to fit things in and we like time blocks. And what I am finding is when I look at church and I look at people gathering, like you have your church service that's an event. I don't even think that's church. It's just an event of worship, which can bring fruit and can be a good thing for people. But it also can bring about what we see with like Carl Lentz, right? Or any megachurch pastor who is an individual that is given all this power that then can really hurt a lot of people and damage like the spiritual life of a lot of people and the relationships of people amongst each other and people's viewpoints of the church. So this whole documentary is done by Vanity Fair, I believe, and they all of those like people researching and reporting this probably have a very specific outlook on the church because of the work that they're doing in this documentary. And so when we think about church, what is church? What should church be? The American way of doing church, the Western way of doing church is this event centered thing that I think churches over time will want to move away from. Uh, and I talked to a friend of mine named Drew Anderson on this podcast on a previous episode. If you want to go listen to that one, and he actually he's been a pastor a lot of his life. He isn't currently, but he was doing pastoral work in a very unique way. It was really interesting. So you can check that episode out. But essentially, like when we think about like I said, this event style church, you're giving one person all this power and all this influence, and if they mess up, then guess what happens? It messes up the whole deal, right? All the rug's pulled out from under it. And then you have Brian Houston, who is like this figurehead of the whole Church of Hillsong, which is another thing. It's like kind of it's a bigger reflection of what happened with Carl Lentz. So what is church? What is church supposed to be? And I think about it as like it's not just this event. It's not just this thing that like you go to, you attend, you get a little bit out of and you go home. Like church, when I think about church, is community and family, right? And I think when we think about like the problems that are happening in the church, like it's so in front of everyone right now. Like there's so much that's going on in the church. Like this question is vital for the future of the church's existence and what it means to pastor and do pastoral work. Because if you keep doing things the same way over and over and over again, and you're gonna get the same results, especially if you keep doing this megachurch thing where these guys get all this power and they get rich and then they can't handle the pressure. Like there's literally a part in the documentary where Carl Lentz goes to Brian Houston and he says, I can't keep doing this. I don't have like the bandwidth. I can't keep preaching. And then Brian Houston responds to him. Carl Lentz says this. He says, well, I was preaching 11 services when I was your age. And so Carl Lentz was like, well, dang, I guess I got to keep pushing forward. I got to stay committed to the church. And, like, there's so many issues with that because if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you're getting the same results. It's not going to end well. And it hasn't ended well for many of these churches. And it's a really, really sad thing. And that question of what is church? What does it mean to pastor? What does it mean to, uh, you know, have community that's authentic and organic? And it's not like this thing that you manufacture. And maybe you can't do that nowadays in the American world, right? And I think it's really an interesting thing because I think you also have to think about how people are viewing the church right now. Like the deconstruction movement is at an all-time high. People are leaving the faith at an all-time high. People don't trust pastors or churches. I think probably at an all-time high. And like I think that the church can be a place that is good. It can be a place where people can find community, be a place where people can find and follow Jesus. And I think it's more about the relationships and the friendships that you can build from something that is natural, not an event. And I don't really know what that looks like, to be honest with you. And I struggle with that. And I struggle with that question of what it is because a lot of people don't feel safe. A lot of people don't trust people. A lot of people are scared of building relationships. And so there's so many things at hand. But I think the big thing that I have been wrestling with lately is church doesn't have to be this event. Church doesn't have to be this thing where one guy is the leader. Church doesn't have to be like light shows and music and emotional, sometimes manipulation, if we're honest. What was interesting, I remember when I was at Hillsong, right? I remember the guy hosting, he literally would give little cues with his hands to the drummer to like raise the emotion level whenever he was praying. And I noticed that and I was like, that's kind of weird. But anyways, so what is church? And then like who's to blame? Like I think the structure system that's been created of what church looks like or what success in church looks like is to blame for things like Carl Lentz happening, where if we didn't have this structure to begin with and we did things in a different way, you wouldn't even be having these things happen. But at the end of the day, we have, made everything in our country a product or something that can be made money off of. And like on this podcast, like I reach out to publishing companies, I talk to authors, and it is intended to sell books, right? When I do these interviews, it's to promote books and they're about Christianity, right? So like we make everything to be a product, right? Like on YouTube, like I get some money from the monetization of the videos or whatever. So like when you create a product out of something and you are relying on paying people to continue on, every single time there's going to be like a possibility of people like taking advantage of that and using that for their own good rather than maybe the good of everyone. And the structure of church that is in place is, I don't think, necessarily good for everyone. I think it can be if done well, but a lot of places there it gets so big, it doesn't do well. I think a church gets to a certain point where it's like, you know what, if you never have a conversation with your pastor, then it's probably not a good thing, right? It's probably not what church was supposed to be. And so I think churches get too big. I think you get to a certain number and it's like there's nothing here that's going to create organic, authentic relationships and community and family. Like literally, you read in the New Testament in the writings where it says brothers and sisters, brothers and sisters in Christ. And that I think that was a literal thing. They really looked at each other as bound together by Christ as a family. And it's a thing that's really, really interesting, right? And so I've been thinking about that for a long time, honestly. Like I remember when Francis Chan wrote the book like Letters to the Church or whatever. And it's just these challenges like of like is church meant to be this way? And it really goes back to like capitalism, unfortunately. Like in our country, like everything is about making a dollar, even church. You got to keep the lights on, you got to pay your pastors, you got to like keep things rolling, and if not, then people are going to lose their jobs. So what can we do to get more people in the door? What can we do to get more people to tithe? How do we get people to serve in the church, which is a whole nother thing, like people getting manipulated into volunteering for like 4 or 5, 6 hours a day and not getting paid. Like that's I think that there's a balance between like there are people that want to serve and volunteer and they have a heart for that. But I think there also is a balance of people that get taken advantage of also. that may not realize what they've signed up for. And I've been in churches where we have volunteers. Uh, but this whole thing with Carl Lentz is like, I think the two big thing is like the structure that's going on is all kind of out of whack. The second thing is like when you let one guy get that much power, it doesn't end well. And like, are you shocked that a pastor, like one man doing all this work, fails, that he can't handle? Part of the documentary I was watching, I was like, man, when he talks about that conversation where he was like, I don't know if I keep doing this. So part of me wonders if he self sabotaged intentionally to get out. Uh, so that wouldn't shock me either. But church is this thing that is a hard thing for people, and it's done a lot of damage, but it's also done good in some ways. But in probably a lot of ways. I mean, there's a lot of unrepresented positivity that the church brings. It's just easier to get news and clicks and things like that when you present the bad that the church does, which is for everything. Everything is about getting clicks, right? So the church is a wild, wild thing. I think that if it's going to keep existing in the way that it is existing, it'll fail. I mean, eventually, I don't think that it'll keep working out. I think the day of the mega church is probably going to be over in the next 10 years. I think that these past, like, less and less trust will be given to these big figures. I think that what those churches basically produce is a lot of individualism, whereas Christianity was never about individualism. It was about community. From the very beginning, you see Jesus with his disciples, and they're like brothers. They're a brotherhood. They're eating together. They're having community together. They are like, they're living as like very close together, knit together people. And if we can get to a place where that is what church is, I think that a lot more safety can be found for people that are deconstructing. Like, churches are a scary place because, like, you can't sometimes trust people to have an honest conversation with them. Whereas if you have, and some people can't trust their family, so like, the idea of family is probably a scary thing too. But if the church can be something where people have relationships where they trust each other, I think that that can be a really good thing. And I think it can be something that brings about some good fruit and uh, health to people that maybe wouldn't go to church otherwise. So yeah, I remember I was watching this documentary. I was just like, this is a bigger issue than just Hillsong. Like, this is happening all the time. Like, you can read a bunch of articles where people abuse their power within the church. You look up the Roy's report, Julie Roy, she does a lot of really good work. It's really sad stuff that she reports, but it's really, really good work. And so I think, Carl Lentz is to blame for his individual actions, but Carl Lentz is a symptom of a much bigger disease, which is the structure of the church that is operating. And I work for the church, so I understand, the reasons for why it exists, the structure that it exists. But yeah, so this has been kind of like what's been on my mind. I did that YouTube video, um, and I think like for people that don't trust the church, I hear you. I understand where you're coming from. When you watch a documentary like this, you're probably like, you know what? That's another reason why I don't deal with church people. I don't go to church. I'm not doing church. I can't handle these dishonest, money grubbing pastors, and I feel that. I understand where you're coming from. But I would encourage you, if like, if you want to look at what church really is, like the people in the New Testament were people that did love each other, and they did care for each other, and they did have concern for each other, and they are aware of each other's problems. One of the letters in Galatians, or the letter of Galatians 6:2, it basically is this verse where it says like, carry the burdens of each other, like carry each other's burdens. This will fulfill the law of Christ, essentially. And it is this challenge, right, that Christians have been called to love each other so much that when someone is dealing with something hard, they're dealing with others' hardships as well. They're walking alongside those people that are struggling, and they're doing life with the people that are hurting. And I kind of interpret that verse of basically like, when someone is broken, you're broken as well. When someone is joyful, you're joyful as well. When someone is disappointed, you're disappointed as well. That there's true care and concern and love for each other, because that is what Jesus truly reflected. When he lived his life, he truly reflected a life that was careful and concerning of other people, and he gave himself away. The ultimate act of Jesus is this death where he gives himself away, and a love so great that he then lives. He is resurrected. And I think that the church can take a huge note of what it looks like to operate in what the church wants to get out of their operation, right? So what does this structure produce? If it just produces attendance, well, that's not really the point of all this anyways. The point of church is community and family following Jesus, centered together, just like Galatians, it says, you carry the burdens of each other. Um, and so I've been challenged by this. I've been challenged by thinking through this. And I think that the whole documentary thing for Hillsong is just another example of a failure of this structure. And I don't know what that looks like, what the solution is, but I know that there are people out there that are smart enough to like figure it out. Maybe I'm one of them. I don't know. But I hope this is helpful. You know, I kind of like this style of episode where I just kind of like think about things throughout the week, and I just sit down and talk. And so I hope that this has been a helpful episode. Like I said, I encourage you to go check it out. It's sad, but it's interesting as well. You know, if you have any thoughts or feedback, you can email me at blake@rethinkingchristianitypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at Rethinking Christianity Podcast. You can subscribe on YouTube, Rethinking Christianity. I have a newsletter that you can find on my website. If you just go to blakefine.com and you click on podcast, there will be a little pop-up and you can listen to other episodes there. If you got any suggestions for episodes or guests you'd like to see on the podcast, or you'd like to send in an audio question that I can do live here and maybe respond to it, I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your support of the podcast. I've been getting a lot of really positive feedback and messages. If I've messaged you on Instagram, I'm trying to go through and message every person that follows the Instagram page and thank them for supporting. Y'all are awesome. I appreciate every person that listens. If you could leave a positive review if you have enjoyed this, and then send the podcast to somebody that needs it, somebody that maybe just doesn't like church and maybe could find it helpful. Thanks so much to all of you. Y'all are awesome. I hope you have a great week. Have a great week. Love you guys. This is Blake. Thanks for listening to Rethinking Christianity. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from Rethinking Christianity, you can follow us on Instagram at Rethinking Christianity Podcast, as well as on YouTube and Facebook. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.